For the month of December, get 25% off your first month or your first year of a membership to the Second Wind Patreon. Supporting independent games media means you get more biting games criticism like this.
So you've probably heard that Warner Brothers is being purchased by Netflix. It's one of the biggest media stories of the past half-decade, and there have been some doozies, let me tell you. It is the acquisition of a major entertainment conglomerate that produces film, television, video games, comic books, and more by a streaming service. It is a massive disruption to a marketplace that has already been heavily disrupted by the streaming wars, by consolidation, and by recent massive strikes. There's really not too much preamble here. So this week, we're going to take a look at this. We're going to explore why Warner Brothers was a unique studio in the larger context of Hollywood history, how the company and the industry ended up in this position, and why this is catastrophic for, well, pretty much everybody. Warner Brothers? More like former brothers, am I right? I can't take credit for that one. Let's just roll the credits. One of the interesting things about Hollywood is that each of the major studios has a unique and distinct identity that informs a lot of their output. Disney is perhaps the most obvious example, with an internal production machine that favors franchises, and which often seems openly hostile to directors with distinct styles or perspectives. Think of all those stories you've heard about directors or writers being rejected from, forced off of, or even just declining to work on Disney properties. And think about how many of their higher profile films are directed by television guys rather than by established film directors. And then there's Paramount with their long-term, non-committed, non-exclusive relationship with Tom Cruise, a relationship that spans decades and multiple franchises. Warner Brothers are really interesting because the studio's been around long enough to have been a major part of multiple waves of Hollywood history. For example, Warners were the studio responsible for The Jazz Singer, the film credited with forcing the transition from silent cinema into talkies. The company also produced Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, the film generally credited with starting the revolutionary new Hollywood movement of the late 1960s and into the 1970s that will give us classics like The Godfather, Jaws, and Star Wars. Across the studio's history, a large part of Warner Brothers' identity was defined by its relationship to Hollywood's artistic community. The company invested in artists, fostering long-term relationships with high-profile filmmakers. For example, Clint Eastwood has directed well over 30 films for the studio over the past half a century and appeared in even more besides. Warner's enjoyed long-term relationships with directors like Stanley Kubrick, Christopher Nolan, Zack Snyder, the Wachowskis, Martin Scorsese, and others. The company saw themselves as the box set studio, with the understanding that even a smaller film like Eastwood's White Hunter, Black Heart, or Bird could be offset against the success of movies like, I don't know, those two where he teams up with a monkey. Ah, pure cinema. No wonder the French love him. But you could also justify letting Eastwood take a punt on a concept that wasn't self-evidently profitable like Honky Tonk Man or Letters from Iwo Jima, based on the understanding that even the movies that didn't set the box office alight in opening weekend could have long-term value in the back catalog. Every teenage film fan is issued, by law, with a copy of Warner Brothers' Stanley Kubrick box set. And, on retirement, every dad receives at least one of the company's several Clint Eastwood box sets. Armchair pundits wondered why Warner's kept letting Zack Snyder direct movies despite their middling box office performance. It's because Warner Brothers measured success in more than just opening weekend numbers. These films were more than just disposable content. They were evergreen additions to a century-old library that could continue to fund the production of more media. As former Warner's president Greg Silverman put it, with the exception of Sucker Punch and the Anti-Fascist Owl movie, all of Snyder's films at Warner's were, quote, very profitable. Very. And look, you don't have to like these individual movies that I'm discussing, that's okay. The beauty of this model was that the success of movies that other people liked and that you didn't funded the production of movies that you liked and other people didn't. It just prevented the homogeneity of cinema as an art form. For decades, this relatively stable model allowed Warner Brothers to thread the needle between art and commerce. Ironically, in large part due to a tech company that began as a mail-order DVD rental service, and which is now buying Warner Brothers. That model is no longer viable.
There's no way to make it economically feasible.
Yeah, we're all trying to find the guy who did this and give him a spanking.
But don't worry, I'm sure letting them buy a movie studio is going to be great for that industry. For years, it felt like Warner Brothers was the place where the doctrine of one for you, one for us held true, where talented creators would be given the freedom to pursue their own interests in return for making the occasional franchise film for the studio. If Clint Eastwood made that bland, forgettable Cold War espionage thriller, then sure, Warner's would let him do his father-son bonding movie that was also a riff on Paper Moon. If Bradley Cooper agreed to make a third Hangover movie, then sure, the studio would distribute his directorial debut. Ben Affleck wants to make Live by Night? That's fine, as long as he agrees to be Batman. And, I don't know, let's throw the accountant in there as well. It was, broadly speaking, a good system. It managed against all odds to manage creative impulses and commercial concerns. It's worth noting that before the release of Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, Warner Brothers were responsible for the last non-IP derived movie to gross over $800 million worldwide, that's Christopher Nolan's Inception in 2010, and the last non-IP derived movie to earn over $700 million worldwide, that's Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity in 2013. Also, Interstellar got there through re-releases, and that's a movie that is distributed internationally by Warner Brothers, in part because they believe so much in Christopher Nolan that they traded their share of South Park for it. And yes, I can already hear those in the comments typing that Oppenheimer was in fact based on the book American Prometheus, so technically it's derived from IP, but you know what I mean. Warner Brothers was a profitable studio, but it was also a massively successful one. As somebody who loves blockbusters, Warner's reliably turned out some of the most interesting and distinct blockbusters produced in my lifetime. Weird and ambitious works from filmmakers with distinct perspectives that redefine genres and styles by pushing them in directions that no other studio would dare. This was even true of the studio's big IP and franchise offerings, which often felt more bespoke and artisanal than the generic offerings from other studios. You can get a sense of this distinction simply by comparing the movies that Tim Burton made for Warner's in the 1990s to the movies that he's made for studios like Fox and Disney in the decades since. And this is just the film studio. It's impossible to cover every facet of Warner's legacy, but it is also worth singling out the studio's contribution to animation, which was often more anarchic and subversive than its main competitors, and the way that the television produced by HBO helped to reshape the medium and usher in a new golden age. Sorry, I'm just feeling a little nostalgic here.
Remember when is the lowest form of conversation.
Even beyond making film and television, Warner's did a lot to foster a culture of film consciousness through brands like Turner Classic Movies and Filmstruck, a streaming service which enjoyed a long partnership with the Criterion Collection. Warner's actively encouraged a love of cinema in broader pop culture. Of course, these divisions of the company have been slowly dismantled and underfunded over the past decade or so, as Warner's has been stripped for parts and for shareholder value. Of course, it's worth acknowledging that companies are not sentient entities. They don't have taste or feeling. However, the people within those companies do. Across Hollywood history, you can see the quality of movies produced by major studios rise and fall depending on the taste of the executives making the decisions about what gets made. During the 1970s, for example, Paramount's output was overseen by cocaine enthusiast and movie mogul Robert Evans and Gulf and Western owner and great name haver Charlie Bloodhorn.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Evans, and I'm Senior Vice President of Paramount Pictures.
Leading to a string of incredible movies like The Godfather, Chinatown, and Sorcerer. Amy Pascal's tenure at Sony saw the studio foster long-term relationships with talents like Seth Rogen and David Fincher. Relationships that largely ended following her departure in another one of those seismic media stories that we talked about at the start of this episode.
Oh, shit! No! That is not happening right now! No!
This difference in taste is the difference between being the studio that makes The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and the studio that makes The Girl in the Spider's Web. While a lot of Warner Brothers' recent blockbuster slate has been somewhat generic and uninspired franchise nonsense that looks like everything else in the marketplace, the studio can still produce distinct blockbusters like Matt Reeves' The Batman or Denis Villeneuve's Dune trilogy. One of David Zaslav's smarter decisions was appointing Pam Abdi and Mike DeLuca as joint heads of production, meaning that in the past year, Warner's has released films like Mickey 17, Sinners, Weapons, and one battle after another. It's more like one banger after another, if you know what I mean. In the old days, directors like Ryan Coogler, Zach Kreger, and Paul Thomas Anderson would have looked forward to long and lucrative creative partnerships with the studio. Instead, these films now feel like the equivalent of cooking your dog a nice steak right before you put it down.
You haven't done yet?
Even setting aside the unique character of Warner Brothers, the loss of the company means the loss of another major classic studio. For decades, Hollywood has been dominated by the Big Six, a core group of studios that produced most of the media released. Within the past decade, one was swallowed by another was bought by a smaller company, and a third has now been swallowed by a streamer. The effect on the wider ecosystem is catastrophic. This means fewer movies being made and distributed to theaters, it means fewer studios buying projects from talent, it means a less diverse pool of media being created. That pool is shrinking, and when that happens, the water tends to get a bit murkier. So now we have some sense of what's being lost. How exactly did we get here? A lot of what we think about as the modern entertainment industry emerged in the wake of the Second World War. In 1948, a Supreme Court ruling led to what has become known as the Paramount Decree. In practical terms, the rule stipulated that studios could not own theater chains. However, it was more broadly an argument that no multimedia company should own both the media being produced and the channels through which it would be distributed. In 1970, the Federal Communications Commission introduced the Financial Interest and Syndication Rules, known colloquially as the FinCin rules, which prevented broadcast networks from owning the shows that they aired. The logic behind these decisions was fairly straightforward. It ensured a free market. It prevented monopoly. They meant that the studios had to make a product that they could sell, and gave the distributors the power to ensure some level of quality control. If you own a studio and theaters distributing the output of the studio, then the media you produce doesn't have to be good. What are you gonna do? Not screen your own movie? However, if you have to compete in the market, it creates an onus to ensure a higher quality product. Of course, studios have been owned by larger financial interests since the earliest days of Hollywood.
He doesn't own MGM any more than Sam Goldwyn. They just run it for the money boys back east.
However, in the old days, companies like Gulf and Western bought Paramount or Coca-Cola bought Columbia Pictures because they liked the movie business, not because they had some secret long-term plan to release movies via Coke can. And look, they did figure out the potential of product placement and cross-brand promotion, but that's a subject for another video. More broadly, there was an understanding that the people who make media should exist separately from the people who sell it to the public, and that this separation was essential to the health of the industry. In recent years, that understanding has been eroded by the dream of vertical integration. Companies that sell you everything. The FinCin rules were rescinded in 1993, and the Department of Justice rescinded the Paramount Decree in 2020, arguing that it no longer applied to the current marketplace. One of the reasons that it no longer applied was because of the intrusion of tech companies into Hollywood, and the opportunities that presented for synergy. The trend arguably began with Sony's purchase of Columbia TriStar in the 1990s, but for the purposes of this video, it's worth focusing on Warner Brothers. In 2001, during the dot-com bubble, it merged with AOL, a merger that was delayed by shareholder lawsuits. By 2009, Warner Brothers would shed AOL like America shed Smash Mouth. Incidentally, and not to spoil the history lesson here, one of the big recurring trends of this narrative is going to be that acquiring Warner Brothers is a lot like invading Russia in the winter. It's a bad idea that doesn't work out for anybody involved. In 2016, perhaps motivated by Comcast's purchase of Universal, AT&T announced their plans to purchase Warner Brothers. The plan here was for a purer form of vertical integration. AT&T would not only own the movies and the streaming services that hosted the movies, but also the internet on which customers would watch the movies on the streaming services, and the physical infrastructure that supported the internet on which customers would watch the movies on the streaming service. It was a beautiful dream if all that you cared about was increasing shareholder value. This is, not coincidentally, around the same time that Warner Brothers started signaling that they were no longer seeking to work with, quote, auteur directors who wanted final cut, because the quality of the movies themselves don't matter if you're treating them like a magazine rack at a supermarket. It is perhaps simplistic and reductive to suggest that movie studios used to be run by people who actually loved movies. Those executives had other hobbies, like cocaine and sex, but they did actually care about the quality of what they produced. You can chart the difference even in the language that this new executive class uses to talk about media. It's no longer films and television. It's just content. It's no longer audiences, it's consumers. And it's no longer enjoying, it's binging. It makes these projects feel less like works of art than like disposable commodities. Formless, shapeless things designed to maximize retention of the service, to keep people watching, to be devoured without any thought or consideration. Naturally, the AT&T deal ended predictably disastrously in the wake of what was dubbed Project Popcorn, the plan to simultaneously release the company's 2021 slate in cinemas and on HBO Max, in a bid to drive up subscriptions. It did not work. Also, it alienated Christopher Nolan, who ended a 2-decade partnership with the studio, but look, it's not like that guy's done anything notable since, right? So, AT&T grabbed the last chapter out of Saigon, the last ornithopter off of Dune, saddled Warner with massive amounts of debt, and then merged it with Discovery, a collection of linear television networks. And that's where we meet this frickin' guy, the living embodiment of mergers and acquisitions. Almost immediately, it was clear to any casual observer that David Zaslav was preparing Warner's for a sale. He trashed completed movies to claim the tax write-off. He worked to minimize spending rather than to maximize revenue. He was reportedly horrified to discover that Clint Eastwood was still making movies for the company, stating,
It's not show friends, it's show business.
because when you live in the world of David Zaslav, Jay Moore is the real hero of Jerry Maguire. Zaslav had been signaling from the moment that he legally could that he was looking for a buyer for Warner Brothers. He even went so far to split the company in half, generating what is known colloquially as a crap co,
I don't know what I expected.
by shedding the loss-generating linear networks that he'd ridden to the top of the water tower. Even this year, there were pointedly no Warner Brothers releases after one battle after another. Nothing in the fourth quarter that could potentially cause share prices to fluctuate one way or the other. It's also very telling that the company's response to James Gunn's Superman wasn't to announce a new slate of films, but instead to rush the sequel into development and production, creating the impression of trying to sneak something in under the wire. Under David Zaslav, Warner's is not a company making long-term plans. And it looks like he found a buyer in Netflix. So, why is this bad news? Throughout its history, Netflix has made it very clear that it does not want to be a producer of films that are released in theaters. It's been fairly unambiguous.
Outdated.
It's an outdated
So when
concept.
someone gets up at the Oscars and says we need to make movies for movie theaters, for the communal experience, that's just an outmoded idea.
I believe it is an outmoded idea for most people.
Netflix is not a media company. It is a tech company that happens to produce media as a byproduct. This was fine when Netflix served as a library of other companies' products, licensing films and television shows from other studios. Those movies had already been in theaters, those shows had already aired on television. They generated revenue for the studios themselves. Now they could be added to a library where they could be accessed at any point. It became a slightly greater concern when Netflix started making its own content, if primarily because it inspired actual Hollywood studios to chase it off the cliff, trying to start their own streaming services and send their own movies direct to streaming with predictably disastrous results. And now it's a very serious issue when Netflix looks to own a studio that used to be one of the big providers of media to theaters and television networks. This is just basic math. Theaters need movies to remain open, and studios that aren't Netflix need theaters to remain open so that the movies that they make can remain profitable. Even other streaming companies like Amazon or Apple have reluctantly embraced theatrical. Just this year, Warner Brothers distributed F1 for Apple, a movie that outgrossed the studio's own Superman. Over the past decade, the number of theatrically released movies from major studios has fallen dramatically. Now, the industry is slowly recovering from a massive global pandemic. Very slowly. Last year, there were 569 movies released theatrically in the United States, meaning that the industry is currently operating at 2010 levels, and even that was below the trend at the time. A diminished number of productions in the wake of a massive writer's strike in 2008. If we look at the number of movies released by major studios, the kinds of movies that tend to hang around in cinemas, they dropped from 128 in 2006 to 87 in 2019 to just 69 in 2024. The loss of a major studio to that ecosystem is catastrophic. To put this in perspective, of the top 16 highest grossing movies of the year to date at the domestic box office, 7 were distributed by Warner Brothers. That's almost half.
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
If those go away, the damage to theaters is catastrophic, and if the damage to theaters is catastrophic, the damage to the other studios in the ecosystem is also catastrophic. And if that happens, it's bad news for everybody except Netflix. And this is discounting the work that Warner's does making television for other providers, producing shows that you may not even realize are Warner shows. Now, Netflix has said it doesn't see all of this going away. It will almost certainly retain HBO in some form or another, using it as a prestige play in the same way that Disney has used FX. After all, Netflix has produced popular streaming hits like Stranger Things or The Diplomat, but nothing quite as prestigious as those classic medium-defining HBO shows. This raises bigger questions about the other parts of the company that Netflix bought. Do we think Netflix want to continue publishing comics? Given that they've been scaling down their attempts to branch into gaming, what are the odds that they want to keep Warner's impressive gaming division? Warner's will be chopped up into digestible chunks to be consumed by a company with a very different business model. Still, at least they promise they'll release movies in theaters, right? Right? When Netflix promises that it will continue to release movies in theaters, there are two things to keep in mind. First of all, Netflix currently claims that it releases over 30 movies a year in theaters, a claim that manages the impressive feat of being technically true while not being true in any way that is actually meaningful. Those 30 releases are on limited screens, in limited windows, don't report box office figures, and are intentionally designed not to draw audiences to theaters, but to advertise the upcoming streaming release. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, which is that Netflix's definition of theatrical release is somewhat broad. The second thing to keep in mind is that Netflix simply has a history of lying about this stuff. Dan Lin, the head of Netflix Film, promised Zach Cregger a robust theatrical release to secure the rights to Cregger's fourth movie, only for Lin to then fly to Prague, where Cregger was filming the new Resident Evil movie, and tell Cregger that actually, that'd be a no on the whole theatrical release thing. Once the paper's signed, Netflix can do pretty much whatever they want.
You can't judge people by what they think or say, only by what they do.
So the question then is, what does Netflix actually want? To give the company credit, in its early years, it produced some really impressive, artistically driven work. Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, Jane Campion's The Power of the Dog, Alfonso Cuarón's Roma. It's very telling that most of the films featured in this montage are from the 2010s, with very few dated later than 2020. It's also very telling that while the studio has managed to foster long-term relationships with directors like Noah Baumbach, Guillermo del Toro, and David Fincher, most of its collaborators are one and done. Martin Scorsese and Spike Lee didn't become Netflix regulars, and despite hosting the last film to date from the duos of the Coens and the Sadfies, not a single Coen or Sadfie brother opted to make their first solo film with Netflix. That seems statistically unlikely. It will also be very interesting whether Rian Johnson decides to work with Netflix again now that his deal for the two Knives Out sequels has elapsed. There is a broader sense that that era has passed. Like Warner's in the mid-2010s, Netflix responded to their own share price crisis by signaling their own desire to get away from producing artistically driven media. It's content, baby, all the way down. So Netflix want two things from Warner's. One, they want the company's massive back catalog and library. Being able to lock a century of film and television behind a single paywall is extremely appealing to Netflix. And it gives the company something that they have long struggled to create: franchises. I don't know about you, but I'm very excited for the next installment in the Gray Man or Rebel Moon franchises. I mean, Netflix promised they were going to make them, and Netflix wouldn't lie to me, right? Right? Also, because they're a tech giant, it gives them a huge data set on which they could potentially train generative AI. So there's that too. The other thing that Netflix want is blockbusters. Netflix are excited to have brands people recognize, like Superman, Batman, and Harry Potter. There is, of course, just one slight problem here. It's hard to get particularly excited about a new Batman movie from the company that brought us Bright, Red Notice, and The Electric State. It also helps that Netflix has removed a competitor for audiences' attention and for potential sellers. When Margot Robbie and Emerald Fennell didn't want to sell their upcoming Wuthering Heights adaptation to Netflix, but wanted it to be seen in theaters, where did they go? They went to Warner's. Not anymore, baby. No needy needing for you. And look, even if the absolute worst case scenario doesn't happen here, with Netflix locking a century of cultural history behind a single paywall, jacking up prices, killing the artistic community, and strangling theaters, whatever happens will still be really bad. If the earthquake is only a 7 on the Richter scale, that's still catastrophic. So, what hope is there? There is some small potential source of hope here. Remember when I said that buying Warner Brothers was like invading Russia in the winter? Well, Netflix's purchase of Warner's is being heavily contested. Part of this is from the Ellison family, who recently bought Paramount and were initially considered the frontrunners to buy Warner's. Of course, Paramount and the Ellisons have their own issues. Nick did an excellent Unpacked a few weeks back about why letting Jared Kushner's Saudi money into gaming via EA Games was a bad idea, and the same logic holds true for their financial involvement with the Ellisons. We've also talked on this show about Paramount's willingness to kowtow to the Trump administration, but let's not pretend that Netflix is also above pandering. Both options are fundamentally, existentially terrifying.
Kids, you're both just awful.
But let's not get too deep into that right now. Lawmakers from across the aisle have voiced their concern about Netflix's acquisition of Warner's, so the deal will be subject to intense scrutiny that may end up delaying it somewhat. It would be foolish to bet against Netflix in this scenario. The company has enough money and enough power to see this through to the bitter end, but the company's stock has taken a dip in the midst of all this chaos. It's also worth acknowledging that even if the deal doesn't go through, Netflix will have effectively hobbled a competitor, denied a potential resource to another, and thrown the industry into chaos for between a year and two before resetting to the current hellscape so this can begin all over again. For Netflix, all that would be a bargain for the $5 billion cancellation fee. Now, Netflix clearly want Warner Brothers. This is not a four-dimensional chess move, but even if they do end up losing, everybody else loses worse. Still, no matter what happens, this is a really ignominious end for perhaps the best of the classic Hollywood studios. The rare media company that managed for the better part of a century to balance the creative and commercial challenges of producing art within a capitalist system. That is gone now. I guess these days in Hollywood, it's just one battle after another. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.
That's all, folks.